Welcome to this podcast, Your Places or Mine, with me, John Goodall, the architectural editor of Country Life.
And me, Clive Aslett, publisher of Triglyph Books.
Today, Clive, we're going to be talking about a subject which you've just published a book on.
Yes,
indeed,
that's absolutely true.
With Triglyph Books.
Yes.
Which is architecture and the king.
Yes, King Charles III, 40 years of architecture.
And this book's just come out, and it's really looking at his whole... it's an overview of his engagement with architecture.
Fantastically good value.
Yes. Special offer, no doubt. You can ask at the end. But it sort of aims to give an overview of his interest in architecture and the story of his architecture. And we thought in this initial episode, we're going to do, I think, 3 podcasts on this. But we thought it'd be really interesting just to give an overview of his engagement with architecture, because he's played such a prominent role, hasn't he?
Yes, and it's a thing that people know he's associated with. It's kind of one of his great enthusiasms. He has many enthusiasms for the environment, for example, for homeopathic medicine, for all sorts of things, for gardening, which rather comes into the subject of architecture. But people know about his love of architecture, but I don't think anybody has really brought together all the different strands of this interest of his and seen what they add up to, which is a lot.
I mean, certainly speaking for myself, that his own interest in architecture really burst onto my consciousness with all the fighting to and fro about the extension to the National Gallery. Is that a sort of decisive... This is in the 80s, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, this was a long time ago. This was in 1984. He was invited to give a speech to an anniversary dinner of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and they were having, I think, it's a whole year of events. The RIBA was 150 years old, so a great dinner at Hampton Court was held, but this was one of a whole series of events, and he was invited to address it. And the extraordinary thing is that was really the first foray that he made into architecture. And I corresponded with Richard Charters, the former Bishop of London, yes, who was a great friend of his from Cambridge years. And I said, was he talking about architecture then? And Richard Charter said, well, not really, not that he could remember. He was talking about other things. He was very interested in philosophy and those things of a serious nature. But he didn't particularly single out architecture. And so I think that this invitation to address the RABA kind of provided a spark which lit a flame.
And, I mean, the architects who were assembled were in for a little bit of a shock, weren't they? I think they expected a banal statement of how much the king loved buildings and what a wonderful job they all did, and they got a completely different... I mean, it's the Prince of Wales then, of course, but they actually got something completely different.
Yes, I think they were expecting really to have their tummies tickled, and it wasn't quite like that. But I suppose that we should talk a bit about the context and what had been happening in architecture when the Prince of Wales, as it then was growing up, because there'd been a disconnect between the architectural profession and the public. And I suppose you could say that by the 80s that was slightly being healed. And in a sense, the Prince wasn't the first one at this particular party. But the extraordinary thing was that because he was the Prince of Wales and he said these things, people listened. Whereas before there were all sorts of people who had been kind of harping on about this.
And the disconnect, just I think it's worth articulating, isn't it?
Yeah.
That, I mean, really, post-war, there's massive rebuilding programmes, but there's a completely different vision of how cities should appear.
Yes.
I know the bombing did a lot of damage, but in fact, town planning probably did a great deal more.
Yes.
Trying to prioritise cars, trying to reconfigure city centres for modern living, and there were some very successful projects in this regard, but there were some. But there were quite a lot where, there have been a lot of projects where the hoped-for vision of a happy 20th century city simply didn't materialise.
No, that's true. We had a previous podcast about Lutyens. We had a Lutyens series. Of course, Lutyens died in 1944, January the 1st. And his world of architecture, which he described as being humanist, because it related to human beings and what they knew and loved and the scale and what kind of corresponded to the way they thought and experienced things, was absolutely thrown out of the window by the Second World War. When the Second World War ended, nobody wanted that long tradition of classicism, which had gone back for 2,000 years.
It was discredited, wasn't it? It seemed to many people discredited, I think.
Yes, I think that, Britain had been grinding on, limping along since the First World War. There'd been very little investment. So a lot of things that we would now, and for example, if you take this area where we're speaking in, Pimlico, that was absolutely clapped out. It was nothing like what it is today, where it's, lots of people happily living in houses without leaky roofs. It wasn't like that. There had been bombing, but there'd been such a terrible lot of underinvestment. And, of course, it was only really when I was a child that London was cleaned. It was absolutely black. I remember being taken by my father to see St Paul's after it had been cleaned, because this was a great event in his life. He'd worked in the city all his life, and it had always been black. And now St Paul's was being revealed as actually having been built out of Portland stone, which was...
When would that have been?
Well, that must have been in the 60s. I would have been very little then. But, it's an early memory.
How transformative it is.
Well, particularly what I remember is my father's reaction. I mean, I didn't really know what he was talking about because, of course, this was just, as you were a child, this was just the world as it was. But for him, I was very conscious that for him it was a great milestone.
And I suppose the 60s had seen... I suppose there are two things worth saying. First of all, I mean, even Lutyens, I know he published in Country Life a plan for the reorganisation of London in the 1930s, which was basically all about driving roads through the centre of the city. Oh. So, I mean, what happened after the war did have there was an echo of it even before the war, but when the war happened, it went ahead with much more vigour than it clearly ever would otherwise have done. That there is then the development in London in the 60s, the first high-rise buildings start to go up,
yes.
Don't they? And by the 80s, there are a number of landmark buildings, which are many of them by prominent architects, and that there is a generation of so-called star-architects
yes.
who've come through the British system, haven't they?
Yes. Well, I think one should say that there were some people, developers, for example, who they weren't necessarily, they're rather greedy people often, but they weren't necessarily evil because they actually hated the legacy amid which they were wanting to do their projects. They hated all these falling down old buildings which were so scruffy, and many had been requisitioned during the war. I mean, everything was upside down, and there was a strong feeling that people wanted to modernise and they wanted to sweep away all that. And this coincided with this architectural movement which had put its toes in the water before the Second World War. Continental modernism, the international style, but it hadn't really taken off in a big way. It was mostly private projects, for people who were probably rich, possibly, but quite kind of leftward leaning and arty. But after the war, it absolutely swept the board, partly because they were offering, a solution, a supposed solution to these issues, these new things to do with traffic. Traffic could be separated from where people walked. It just turned out to be a disaster. It didn't work at all. But it seemed to be a good idea at the time that traffic would be on the ground level and that pedestrians would be walking away in peace and comfort
up above,
higher up. In fact, this didn't correspond to the way that people actually used. But it was also cheap. You see, building these high-rise buildings out of mass-produced materials that was much, much cheaper than the architecture that Lutyens designed, for example.
One of the things I was really interested in...
Of course, it didn't last. It was very cheap. We had no money, so we had no alternative. But it was building, and people may not have realised, but it was building structures that were going to last a very short time. So whether it was really cheap in the long run is a debatable point.
Which is still something that's an issue, isn't it? You can build thousands and millions of houses, but if they're of no quality, to whose benefit are you really building?
No, quite. And of course, we're now so conscious of the embedded carbon that building these things again and again, that's not a very good way of doing it.
I suppose the other thing that's worth saying is that, I mean, it's a point made, I think, by Gavin Stamp in his brilliant book, recent book, posthumous book, Interwar Years, that the story of modernism absolutely, no less than the buildings, but the story of modernism completely dominated the narrative of architectural teaching. And so in Interwar Years, he makes the point that, in fact, people are building in a wide variety of styles, of which modernism is one. But by post-war, it's as though everybody forgot about all those other things.
Oh, yes.
And just became absolutely monomaniacal, that there was one way forward, and it was this system of modernism. And, of course, there were architects who dissented from that view, but the mainstream architectural schools, it was all teaching that this was the way to build, and it was very dominant and aggressively argued, and that this...
It's like a cult, really, but the cult took over the entire profession.
Yes, indeed. And it's sort of into this that the Prince of Wales's speech is dropped, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. I wrote a piece when I was researching the book, which was written in the New York Times, and it quoted an anonymous person from Prince of Wales's circle. And the journalist had asked about the Prince of Wales's previous experience of architecture, and this anonymous person said, well, it really consisted of his driving around with being driven around with his mother and grandmother in a Rolls Royce, and hearing them look out the window and saying, isn't all this ghastly? But I thought that was very perceptive, because actually it was what everybody was doing, not in a Rolls Royce, but nearly everybody, except architects, was going around saying, oh, look what's happening. We hate it. This is awful. There was also the big issue about housing, which was that people were being turfed out of terraces, which sometimes had been bombed out, but also had this big issue of underinvestment, where, at a later point, they were gentrified, and, ironically now, they're terribly expensive. But broadly speaking, working class people were being turfed out and forcibly rehoused in these high-rise blocks. And so all the friendships that they had developed, and people helping each other out and everything with these, rather clapped out and possibly insanitary sort of arrangements that they had in the East End, these terraces, small terraces. It was terrible for them to be put into these high-rise buildings where they didn't know their neighbours, and it was particularly bad for families with children, because the children couldn't play in the street.
It's really interesting. There's an echo of that in what's just happened with HS2, of course. The dispossession of large communities for the construction of the railway line. I understand that has been a problem too, and it's it's really complex, and it's revealed all these
because in the streets people build up these
relationships,
with the people in the corner shops and all,
and it does break. It completely shatters.
Yes.
And then and particularly
older people, there are people who know them. Anyway, that was also something that the Prince was concerned about, or it certainly emerged. But really, I don't think anybody had any suspicion that he was very focused on architecture before this speech at Hampton Court in 1984. And indeed, my guess would be he took a lot of trouble over the speech, and I think that probably, although sadly I wasn't really able to get this confirmed because Colin Amory was such a perfect courtier that all his papers I think they've been left to the RIBA, but nobody can look at them for 50 years.
Colin Amory was the advisor, wasn't he?
Well, I think, yes, I'm pretty sure that's correct. I haven't quite pinned that down, despite having asked people. But anyway, Prince himself took a lot of trouble over the speech. He found the advisor. He also wrote himself. He didn't finish writing the speech until the very morning that he gave it.
I'd also heard that Colin Amory was the person who actually drafted large sections of the speech.
It is a very good speech.
It is. Who was Colin Amory?
Oh, yes. Well, Colin Amory was an immensely civilised and delightful man who was by nature a sort of courtier, really. And so he was very well suited to this role. He was very discreet, and he loved kind of moving in the background, putting interested people in touch with each other, and forming groups, and he liked that role, not necessarily very much in the public eye, although he also, I can't quite remember at what point this was, it might have been a little bit later, but he had a very, very good, this was an age in which newspapers wrote about architecture, and yes. Colin had a column in the Financial Times. It was superb. It was sort of what was called what did we call it? Higher journalism, I think. But it was journalism of a sort of brainy kind, which barely exists anymore. Nobody, newspapers just don't have that breadth of coverage. It's all been hollowed out. But but Colin was highly respected.
As an architectural critic, basically.
As an architectural critic, but he had also had, with people like Mark Girouard, and he was a great friend of Gavin Stamp. They were very, very committed to conservation. There was a big conservation movement in the 1970s when everything was being knocked down. People really mourned, or some people really mourned the loss of Victorian architecture, for example, which was pretty whole scale.
It's sort of muscular, and it provoked a very strong reaction, didn't it? Some people loved it.
Yes, it was a bit of an acquired taste. I wouldn't say that everybody was mourning it, perhaps, but I think a lot of people were mourning the loss of traditional, what we would now call urbanism,
Yeah.
in which these Victorian structures were part.
It is a peculiarity that many Victorian civic structures are Gothic, and I feel that many people think of what would be called now the traditional architecture movement is classical.
Yes, well, that's
a strange
true.
kind of disjunction in, though, particularly things like the renovation of St Pancras Station. I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves in many ways. They have been clearly enormously popular and really impressed people, once again, with the character of Victorian architecture.
The 70s was a bit of a heroic age for conservation. It's when Marcus Binney started Save Britain's Heritage, which was very, very, very effective. And he mounted, with others, with Simon Jenkins and others, he mounted huge campaigns and got, enormous public traction, not least because it was something that, that the public cared about and wanted to read about, took this cause of conservation and kind of weaponised it through the media. He was Marcus in particular was very successful. He ended very driven and very successful in getting these conservation campaigns a very high profile, particularly through the press, but also through television and radio.
And this all plays to your point, doesn't it, that there's a very coherent architectural establishment, it's doing what it wants, and there is, in fact, a very substantial groundswell of reaction against what it's trying to do. And I don't know whether it's intensifying or not at this particular moment in time, but again, we come back to 1984, and I suppose the crucial thing is this proposal to extend the National Gallery.
Yes, I suppose I should just, following on from that previous point, there was Private Eye. In those days, everybody read Private Eye. It was extremely funny. We all thought it was very funny. But also there was a sort of serious aspect to it. And one of the things it ran, one of the columns it had, was called The Nooks and Corners of the New Barbarism, which was begun by Sir John Betjeman. And the New Barbarism was a play on New Brutalism. Brutalism was this style of concrete bunkers with shuttered concrete and everything, which was typified by the Hayward Gallery on the South Bank. It was so widely hated. Now some people seem to rather like it, but anyway,
I do quite like it. I do enjoy it.
You young trendy person. Typical. Gosh. But anyway. This was written by somebody called Pilotti. It was written under a pseudonym. The pseudonym was Pilotti. Well, Pilotti were these peers that Le Corbusier used, and every week it lambasted modern architecture, the modern horrors in architecture.
It was Gavin Stamp who took on Pilotti, wasn't it?
Well, he took it on. It was Betjeman, and then it was Candida Lighted Green, who was Betjeman's daughter, and then quite a few years afterwards, it was Gavin Stamp. And Gavin wrote it every week or every fortnight, I think it was. Yes. Because Private Eye was fortnightly, and he wrote it for years and years and years, and he never gave up. He was like a terrier who got his teeth into the trouser seat of modernism, and things like James Stirling's History Faculty building in Cambridge. He pursued this one-person vendetta. And of course, in a sense, he was right, because that building has never, ever, ever worked. And now, I think it maybe is grade 2 star or something in terms of listing, but to remake the History Faculty building, which is all glass, it's these cascades of glass, planned like an open book, so it's like a V, to make it watertight and so that it doesn't heat up like a conservatory in the summer, costs the most fantastic amount of money, and great technical to make this inherently very unusable and very unuser-friendly building functional is actually extremely expensive and difficult, and it was the most tremendous challenge.
It's very interesting. I must confess, I still very much read Private Eye. I love it. And but Gavin's articles that he did, they did have a particular character of his knowing a whole register of buildings. I suppose it comes out in his book, Into War Years, of knowing a kind of register of buildings and a breadth of places. He wasn't just looking at London. He knew the streets in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Glasgow. He was
hugely knowledgeable, and he led lots of tours around these places, for example, the Victorian Society. So that was one of the things that he liked doing. He was always touring, very quickly. People weren't allowed to pause for too long to reflect on these things. It wasn't to get back on the bus and see another one. So he saw an enormous number of things, but he had this he always reminded me, he was very tall and very severe looking. He reminded me of... He could well have come out of Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army.
The architect. Well, I had such...
Wearing great big boots.
I had many happy tours with him. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, no, it was such a great man. But he had this particular combination of great knowledge and...
a driving determination.
A zeal, which is absolutely uncompromising.
But we're getting distracted.
We are. But anyway, that was the background, that these things had been going on. And the Prince of Wales would certainly have... Everybody read Private Eye, for example. And I'm sure that he did, because everyone's talking about it at dinner parties and things, swapping these jokes. Did you see? And so, that was part of the background. But the Prince of Wales himself, I don't know that he had a depth of interest before that. When he was a young man, he was jumping out of aeroplanes with parachutes and playing polo.
So what happened? And just very quickly, let's just talk about this particular speech in the context. There's a proposal to extend the National Gallery. There's a building immediately beside it on Trafalgar Square, which is going to be redeveloped.
Yes.
And there are plans that have been put forward, aren't there? I mean, what in the...
Yes. I mean, it's all... I mean, what the Prince of Wales said in his speech, which is really very, very memorable and has... Perhaps it was written by Colin, I don't know. But anyway, it's a phrase which entered the language. He said that this new extension to the National Gallery would be like a carbuncle on the face of an old and loved friend. Mm. And that was a brilliant summary. There was a bit of prehistory to it all, in the sense that it was a bit rough on the people who designed this carbuncle, because the whole business of procuring this new building had been so difficult. But one of the reasons that they pushed this forward was that this was the 1980s. Margaret Thatcher had come in with her government, and one of the things that the Thatcher government wanted the state sector to do was to get rid of all its unwanted bits of land and stuff so that other people could develop them. And the National Gallery had this site which had a warehouse on it. It seems rather incredible. It was on Trafalgar Square. But there was this big sort of repository that it owned, and it had to move something forward because otherwise it was going to have to sell it. So it went to the people who ran the National Gallery, went to the Secretary of State for the Environment, which was Michael Heseltine, who was the person responsible for sort of new buildings and things. And, of course, they didn't get very far because there was no money. This was a time when public expenditure was being kept very tightly under control. But then Noel Annan, who was the chairman of the trustees, realised that in America, museums were being developed in a partnership with the private sector. Well, this was a very American thing to do because people give philanthropically, and there's not the same fear of the public sector, of the private sector in America, and these partnerships work. So he had this idea, and he went to put this to Michael Heseltine, who thought this was fantastic. This would be conservatism in action, that you would get what the National Gallery wanted, which was these new rooms for its early Renaissance pictures, but it would be all paid for by developing office space underneath. Well, it turned out that this was, to cut a long story short, a complete disaster. The National Gallery, Michael Heseltine liked it so much that he set up a competition under Sir Hugh Casson, on which neither the director of the National Gallery nor the chairman sat. They weren't consulted at all. So it had been taken out of the hands of the National Gallery.
And we should just interject, Hugh Casson, of course, very interesting because he's a figure who had been very involved with he was patronised by the Queen and Prince Philip. He designed the interiors, didn't he, of the Royal Yacht?
Yes.
And was very close to them and had been very involved in the design of the South Bank after the war, hadn't he?
By that stage, he was a great establishment figure.
Yeah.
And so I think he was probably president of the Royal Academy.
That's right.
And so he was the sort of natural choice for a grandee. But it was clearly not going to be it was never going to be very satisfactory for the National Gallery. They didn't, ABK was the name of the practice which got the job from this competition. ABK, they wanted Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, who were an American company. That was the winning solution that they favoured, but it wasn't given to them. They were just ignored. Anyway, as the project developed, it was all a fiasco, and the amount that was allocated to the National Gallery got smaller and smaller. So it wasn't entirely the architect's fault. But anyway...
So the amount of space that they were being allocated within the new building.
Yes.
Because, of course, there's no money in building galleries, but there's lots of money in building office spaces.
Yes, that's exactly right. Exactly right. And it has to be said that ABK didn't want to be respectful to Wilkins's National Gallery, which had been built about 1820. Yeah. And to be fair, it wasn't many people who really liked that building as a building. It's it's very restrained and neoclassical. It wasn't public taste particularly. Wilkins wasn't, in those days, sort of very highly rated as an architect. So
I bet it's not really a very brilliant building even now.
Sure.
Don't you think?
Some of your opinions, just.
I mean, it's a really interesting building, but I mean, it's not. It's a bit of a botch itself, I think.
Well, I was brought up to view it as a picturesque building because it stands back from St Martin's in the Fields. Anyway, that's another
issue.
Yeah. That's another matter.
What's it like to be wrong, Clive? That's beside the point.
So the Prince focused on this competition. He called what ABK were doing this Carbuncle. There's a rather odd scheme, which a very well-intentioned man who, curious enough, played polo with the Prince of Wales, so knew him. He was a friend called Peter Palumbo, who was a property developer. He had the well-intentioned idea of adding lustre to the City of London by building a glass skyscraper by Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe was a German architect who then worked in Chicago. Yes, one of the heroes of modernism. But the problem was he had died in the 1960s. So this was something he had designed. I think he had designed it for Palumbo or maybe Peter Palumbo's father. But the design was there. But can you imagine erecting? I mean, Mies van der Rohe famously said, "God is in the details." Yeah. But God would have had to have taken care of these details because Mies van der Rohe wasn't there to do it anymore. So that was a rather ludicrous thing, which was going through planning. And
this was in the city, though, at the same time, concurrently?
Yes, concurrent. This was in the City of London. So the two things that Prince Charles particularly had a pop at were these two buildings. And he said, how awful that... He called it a glass stump. That wasn't quite such a good formulation, although it went down... It also became a bit of a household phrase because it wasn't a stump, it was a very tall building. But nevertheless, the fact that the Prince had got them in his sights meant that it had enormous coverage.
It must have been electrifying to sit through the speech. I mean, I would love to have been a fly on the wall in the sense, we've all been to these big dinners and the person, the after-dinner speaker, stands up to speak, and you can imagine everybody sort of expecting something rather banal. But then gradually, as they must have, through the haze of
their
the
blood
wine,
would have run cold.
You could suddenly realise that something was being said that was completely unthinkable.
Yes, he sent the speech to the bigwigs of the RIBA in the morning, saying, and by the way, this is going to appear in the Times tomorrow. So, the sort of upper echelon. Well, warned up to a point, a very little, very short warning. But they were probably rather confident that they were going to be given a pat on the back by the Prince because they had been doing a good job with this festival of architecture that they'd been doing. And they had also, and this was slightly bad luck, that they'd given the gold medal that year, which the Prince was there to present, to a man called Charles Correa, who was Indian. And, he was a sort of architect whom the Prince would have loved and possibly did love. But, of course, his gold medal, because he came from India and he was very he was married to a great craftswoman, I think. And he was very much doing the sort of thing that the Prince would have liked, but very humane and concerned for the people. But the award of the gold medal, which was sort of quite imaginative for the RIBA in the 80s, giving it to this Indian architect whom not many people generally had heard of, that was completely overshadowed by what the Prince said. I think, to be fair, in this respect to the Prince, that I think that everybody was surprised by the reception that his words got. So, obviously, this was something that he cared about, and he thought he could make a noise on this subject. But I suspect that he hadn't really quite foreseen how it would be. And although it wasn't terribly original what he said, he was articulating a very widely held view. I mean, he was kind of ridiculed. People said, oh, well, this is only one person. But actually it wasn't. The whole thing was that the architectural establishment had become detached from the rest of the community. And everybody was saying these things, but it was only when Prince Charles said them that anybody noticed. But this gave him what we would now call a great agency. And I think that kind of set him on a path, because he then saw this was something he could do. It gave him a purpose.
And we will discuss that in the second part of the talk.
Good.
Welcome back to Your Places or Mine with me, John Goodall.
And me, Clive Hazlitt.
We've just been hearing about the Prince of Wales and how he became interested, really, almost serendipitously in architecture. And that his speech,
we've launched him.
Yeah, we've launched him, and the speech at Hampton Court launches his own interest. And, I mean, it's an interest that sort of develops in all sorts of interesting ways. I think when we're talking, we're going to, I think, try and enumerate some of the ways in which that's expressed over the next 4 decades. But we may well be coming back and thinking about some of these themes again independently, because they're so individually important. But Clive, starting off, what happens immediately after the speech? There's the controversy. There's a revived interest in what what architects do. Public debate about what people want towns to look like, and what happens as a product of that initially. What does the Prince Charles, as then now the King, do in response?
Well, he'd found this ball in play, and he picked it up and ran with it. And there were 2 strands, I think, to begin with. One was that he was very, very concerned with where people lived. There was a movement, it was called community architecture, and it was taking the extraordinary novel idea that if you were going to rehouse a community, you were going to ask them about the sort of houses they might like to live in before you built them. The previous point of view by the international style had been that you studied Le Corbusier and did what he said. And this was not actually very popular in the British context. So there was a movement that was sort of quite difficult to implement, because to do it properly, to do all this consultation, meant that architects had to sit down with community groups in community halls and have endless cups of tea. And it took ages and ages and ages to consult everybody about exactly what it was that they wanted, and then the consensus building everything. So it was quite difficult, and probably attracted rather idealistic, maybe left-wing types. But anyway, that was a movement, and Prince Charles was very much involved with it. He had as his advisor for a time a chap called Rod Hackney, who had done this particularly as a sort of, practically as a student. He'd lived in Macclesfield, I think it was, and there was a terrace there. He was at Manchester University, and he got this place to live. He was looking for somewhere he had to support himself, and he found cheap digs. He didn't want to pay exorbitant rents, so he actually bought this practically a slum house in Macclesfield, and then found that the council was going to demolish it all. So he got together with other people in the street, and they said, no, this wasn't what we want to happen at all. They managed to raise the relatively small amount of money, but very significant to them, to buy out their leases and to do what they wanted. And it was a movement which was, it was difficult for the reason that I said, that it required very idealistic architects who didn't mind giving up all their time
to do these things.
But also, it has to be said, and this is something that Gavin Stapp, whom we referred to earlier, did say, that the architectural output was slightly unsatisfactory, because whereas you would have had these terraces, which were all nicely organised in a sort of subclassical form, even these cheap ones, they were Georgian terraces, basically organised on classical principles. When everybody had their own house, they wanted their own front doors, and they were personalising. So the architectural, it became very kind of folksy and like knitting, or
that everyone had their own their own identity within the...
Yes, and so it looked a terrible mess from an architectural point of view. So it wasn't sort of perfect solution, and Rod Hackney slightly shot himself in the foot by revealing something that Prince Charles had said to him on the royal train when there were riots taking place, and he got into very hot water when he revealed what Prince Charles had said to him about what he was very worried about, what the kingdom would be like when he became king, which was a sort of unthinkable thing to say, because it implied that he was just couldn't wait to get his mother's role, which of course was very unfair. So Rod Hackney was rather out. But the other strand, but I think that did remain as an issue very, very important, because this was trying to find a way that people would live in new communities, but not being shoved into these high-rise flats.
Don't you think it is worth saying? I mean, it still seems to me a contention within architecture, but certainly in the 80s, this belief that architecture could improve social conditions. And of course, I mean, it's obviously true. If you have a decent house to live in, it's much best to live in than a squalid slum. But this idea that architects could actually create environments which imposed improvement on communities, I think that there's confidence that architecture was a tool that could be used to improve people's lives. And
well, of course, it's true in a subtle way. I mean, if you build buildings, I mean, the ones which we're looking at now out of the windows of this house, which is a development built by Darwin and Dark in about 1970. I mean, that is designed so that as people move through the development, they inevitably meet each other, because they're going along these little rather charming, I think, alleyways with brick pavements and stuff, and inevitably the residents of that big development are meeting each other. And so you can design in the fact that people are not going to be alienated by waiting for urine-smelling lifts which don't work.
I mean, of course, you're absolutely right, and it's true, and it does constrain how you live. But of course, I think one of the lessons of the 60s and 70s was also that if you built buildings with the best will in the world and created wonderful environments for people to live in, if in fact the wrong kinds of people began to live in them, they would still, collapse socially. I mean, if you don't have a sort of fabric of people working and in other words, architecture alone doesn't regenerate an area. You can't regenerate an area simply by building beautiful buildings. And in fact, one of the strange things is that there are examples out there of brutalist buildings which went to the very, very bottom and became slums, and then were rediscovered by, middle class groups, and then suddenly became incredibly fashionable places to live. And I mean, the Barbican would be a very good example of somewhere that's now extremely desirable to live.
Or even the Trellick Tower, which was regarded as being the absolute pits, which is sort of in the Paddington area, built by an architect called Erno Goldfinger, who incidentally lent his name to the James Bond villain because he had a ding-dong with Ian Fleming. But that he built these continental modernist blocks of flats, which, of course, was always intended that they would have concierge and people to look after them and that they would be well maintained. But the councils who owned them, didn't do that. Now they've been recolonised by the types you described, but also they tend to be people without children. They tend to be couples or something, and they're totally well suited for that. And I've been in some of those flats. You look out, they've got these extraordinary views, and you're looking down on the railway tracks. It's like a train set way below you, but it's all quite exciting. But you've got to be the right sort of person. And they've got to be maintained.
No, I do agree, and I suppose all I'm trying to say is that there is this strange. I mean, I think there was great confidence in immediately after the war that actually building the right buildings could transform communities. They do change communities, but you do need to maintain them, and there are people for those types of buildings. So it's not that one thing is right and another is wrong, but it is really interesting that there's so much more than just the architecture that creates the places. In short,
yes, that's true. That is perfectly true. And this was something which Prince Charles and the Duchy of Cornwall very much kind of took on when they developed their own projects at Poundbury and later at Nansledan, which are Prince Charles's kind of model developments.
And they're planned towns, really, aren't they? They're
town extensions, to be fair, and they're attached to existing towns. And so they don't have all the hospitals and things, but they have kind of community services which are provided. But crucially, there's a whole raft of things which perhaps we should get onto later, or we'll be distracted.
That is an entire subject, isn't it?
It is. That's a huge subject. And the planning ideas which the Duchy of Cornwall, using Leon Creer, worked out and introduced, they were very radical, and they were also very, very kind of across the board in just the way you were describing, because it wasn't just about the way the place looked. It was about the way the place had been conceived, and the way that people could walk to work, and the way that particularly the car was going to have a second. Anyway, we mustn't talk about that now.
But so on the one side, he's very interested in this idea that architects must speak to the people they're going to build for. That people who are going to live in these houses become, in a sense, clients to the architects. As you say, it requires a lot of resources. It is not always an easy thing to do. And if you ask 100 people what they want, you do tend to get 100 different answers.
Yes,
but it is better than just ignoring it altogether.
Well, that's absolutely
and saying, this is what you're going to like this, whatever I produce. And so he's also involved, isn't he, practically? I mean, the drawing school and things that he sets up.
Well, I think I should say before that there were different strands that the Prince liked. He I think is fair. I mean, he liked old buildings. He did a lot of work in conservation. He liked arts and crafts things. He liked people making things. He liked that kind of movement. He, in his own, he was fond of whimsy. He would be taken around by his friends like the Bannermans, his garden designers, and particularly Candida Eliza Green, Betjeman's daughter, and apparently he would go, he was quite theatrical, so he'd sort of dress himself up in various disguises so that nobody was incognito, and then he'd jump into his Aston Martin and drive so fast that the police detail couldn't have great difficulty in keeping up with him. And Candida Eliza Green would take him to see all these very interesting things that were happening, and so he's enormously knowledgeable. Anyway, so there are many strands to his interest, but one which kind of emerged as a lead strand, as it were, although perhaps not to put, is not like this is the only thing that he likes, but he became very interested in classicism. And I think the point about classicism is that it is a very long tradition, which is one thing he liked. But I think it answered some of these problems because people like walking around Georgian London, for example. But individually, these buildings and terraces are not always the highest possible grade of architecture. But the fact is that the people who were building them, who often they were just family builders, they could do it because there were rules. And so this was a way of kind of rolling out a better way of buildings that people found attractive to both look at and also to live in and walk around. So he liked classicism, and there'd been a clue to this because the Duchy of Cornwall had bought him Highgrove as a place just before he got married. And he'd got this little, well, it wasn't little, but it was a country house by not very well-known architect called Anthony Keck, probably. And it was quite plain, and he sort of ramped it up a little bit.
And it's late 18th century.
Yes, that's right, but in that plain style.
So in the Cotswolds. And
yes, that's right, outside Tetbury. Lovely. But tabula rasa as regards garden, or at least he thought so. So he immediately began developing a garden, asking lots of people. But he also did works on the house, which was sort of making it a bit more classical, a bit more obviously classical. So that was perhaps a bit of a clue as to his own personal preference. But a very important scheme came up in the late 80s, which was, well, it was extraordinary, really. After the Second World War, the area around St. Paul's was redeveloped. It had been very, very badly bombed because Churchill himself had said all the efforts we must put into, during the Blitz must be to save St. Paul's. This is a great national monument, a symbol of our nation. And the Luftwaffe was after it. And so all these incendiary bombs were being dropped. And the fire services were directing their jets of water onto St. Paul's. But the surroundings were very, very badly damaged. But instead of building, after the Great Fire of London in 1666, Wren couldn't impose a new structure on the city of London, could he? He
tried to.
He tried to.
But he very quickly discovered that
it wasn't possible because there were all these, little ownerships, and it was just would have taken too long.
And in complete contrast to Napoleon III in Paris, when just
Yes.
driving all these avenues through medieval Paris and everybody being forced to clear out and reconfigure their lives. In London, everything just comes straight back.
Well, that was the British way,
Yeah.
but not after the Second World War, because an architect of Holford got hold of it. He was very well placed and very senior in the sort of planning establishment. And he obliterated this area around St. Paul's, or at least on one side of it. And there had been Paternoster Row, very important street, because it was called Paternoster, which means Our Father, because it's where people printed Bibles. And it was the centre of printing, and printing of all kinds. Samuel Pepys went there to buy books and things, which was right next to St. Paul's. They took this name, the row itself, utterly obliterated, and it became Paternoster Square. And this was quite a big development with a number of high-rise, well, they weren't high-rise in our terms, but they're high-rise in the terms of the day, towers. And again, this separation of cars on the lower deck, as it were, and then a deck, which was the actual square with people moving around. It was never, I don't think, very popular. And the extraordinary thing was that by the late 80s, when there was a demand, computers were coming in and dealing floors, and you needed these trading floors with computers underneath, because they needed lots and lots of cables. these buildings that had been built in the late 60s were very unadaptable. And 25 years after they'd been finished, they all had to come down.
I vaguely remember walking on Paternoster Square in the late 80s, and it was must have been on a Sunday, but totally without people. It was incredibly depressing. That's my memory of it, with a skateboarder or something. And there was nothing else. Just one skateboarder moving around, and just this huge expanse of
it was totally alien, the feeling of it. But time had come for it to come down, and there was a proposal by property developers to put up something which was very commercial. It was going to maximise the use of the site for commercial purposes. And there was a lady, a very feisty lady, who ran something called the London Society, and she got hold of the Prince at some reception or another and alerted him to this proposal to rebuild Paternoster Square, concerned that the replacement was going to be different, but not qualitatively very much better. And the Prince made this a cause. And at the same time, John Simpson, the architect, a very young, I'm not sure he was out of his 20s at the time, a very young classical architect, also took this subject up and made a sort of counter scheme, which you don't have to own a building, own a site to put in planning permission. Anybody can put in planning permission, whether they own the site or not, and that's what he intended to do. So then the Prince got another platform. He'd had this great platform at Hampton Court addressing the RABA, but he now had another platform because he was asked to address the bigwigs of the City of London, including the property developers themselves, at the Mansion House. And he took that opportunity really to lay into this scheme and say, surely we can do something better. We made a terrible horlicks of building Paternoster Square in the first place in the 60s, but now we've got a chance to redeem ourselves. The Luftwaffe, when it bombed the City of London, at least only knocked buildings down. It didn't put something horrible in their place. We have done that. And so this was very, very resonant. And the property developers were forced to revisit their competition and hold an exhibition in the crypt of St Paul's of all the entries. It had been a limited competition, I think there were 6 or 7 of them, and John Simpson's scheme. And John is brilliant at engaging with the public, and he kept a book of comments. And the comments were pretty favourable to his scheme and pretty damning of the other scheme. It became so difficult for the existing property developer to develop it that he sold to somebody who really adopted the Simpson scheme. It was really extraordinary. And then John Simpson could invite all the classical architects, some American, like Alan Greenberg, as well as Quinlan Terry and everybody.
And William Whitfield was involved, wasn't he?
Well, he was in the end, because actually this wasn't built entirely as John Simpson had designed it. I think John himself recognises, he was a very young man. In dealing with it, he could have been more diplomatic.
Yeah.
But of course, he had a cause, and he had the backing of the Prince of Wales. But in the end, then there was a recession in the early 90s, and it all went terribly pear-shaped. And then it was taken on by a different developer, and William Whitfield developed essentially to the John Simpson's footprint. I mean, I think it's a very successful development. But it's not what John had designed.
I also think it's really important to say that one of the most brilliantly successful details of it, in my view, is when you have great cathedral buildings, everybody seems to want to clear away buildings around them to let them stand free. And in fact, that often diminishes them. And one of the most brilliant details of that new scheme is the north transept of St Paul's Cathedral. If you walk up to, there is now a new Cannon Row, and it's a narrow street, and it frames that north transept,
yes.
Wren's north transept, and it encloses the view. And I think it's one of the most dramatic, pieces of civic design, of its kind that's been done recently. It seems to me a superbly successful creation of a dense development in the immediate juxtaposition to a great, nationally recognised building. It's really interesting. But
yes.
Clive, the Prince of Wales, he also, he's agitating through speeches. There are these major, projects that he is involved with. He also writes a book, doesn't he? A Vision of Britain.
Yes,
what is
that's true. And the book that he wrote was really a printed form of this television programme. It's rather extraordinary that the Prince of Wales was making his own television programme about the things he believed in, because he got a lot of flack. People were saying, well, why don't you tell us what you really think? Why don't you put on the table the buildings that you most
like? Yes, you
all that
can't
sort
criticise
of thing.
us without telling us what you think.
Yes, that's right. And of course, actually, he then went on to develop Poundbury. He really did his own developments at Poundbury and elsewhere, and those really were, they were doing exactly what his critics had been urging him to do, which was, if you don't like what we're doing, you do it. And he did. It was very good. But he also, he'd really got the bit between his teeth, because he went on to address this problem of education, which you mentioned, which was that and to some extent it's the case still, because architecture schools only had one viewpoint, which was modernist. And so if you were interested in something else, you were really a pariah.
Yes, and people do talk about, architects I've spoken to who don't design modernist buildings, a number of them have talked about how difficult it was, that their teachers actually took it out on them, that they didn't follow the rules that they were being taught, and that it was vindictive almost. That they were...
absolutely. It was because it was this theological belief that modernism was...
the answer.
Was the answer, and people would come to love it. It's just they couldn't see that, there was a strong view articulated by Richard Rogers, the architect, amongst other people, that every advance in architecture had been met by critics. Well, of course, to a certain extent that was true, but it was so massively unpopular that the scale of what was happening and the disruption of the cities that people love, that actually many people have never come to love it. So it wasn't quite true to say that people were just reacting against the new. There was something intrinsic to the new that people found totally hostile. But the Prince himself introduced first some summer schools, and then actually an institute. Well, it went through different names, but something it didn't actually succeed in getting accreditation, which was really the problem. So it couldn't actually offer a degree or part of a degree for architects. So it was rather a minority taste, and finally it didn't last very long, but it was very, very creative whilst it lasted. And the Prince got people, he tended to meet lots of people in his travels. The Prince is obviously extraordinarily well travelled because he's gone around the world. And wherever he goes, he looks at buildings, he talks to architects. He is enormously well informed. But the downside is that he meets all these people and he gets so excited by these new people he meets that he wants to bring them onto his project, which was slightly a problem of Poundbury in the early days. It was a bit of an architectural zoo. There were too many of these.
It's so eclectic that it ceases to have coherence.
But he would get people representing all, sacred geometry of Islam would be one thing, or psychological people who were interested in psychology and arts and crafts and classicism. And all types, even Norman Foster, I think, went there. Norman Foster, the apostle of high tech. Everybody felt that they wanted to be involved in some kind of way. So it was, if you had come, say, as some people did, from Poland, or you'd had that sort of architectural training, because the Iron Curtain had fallen, but still everything was organised on those lines, rather old-fashioned, or very old-fashioned by the way we would look at it. Everything was very structured, and you found this rather difficult to kind of relate to, because there were all these choices. But if you were somebody who was just a young person excited by it was immensely stimulating to have all these different people, sometimes not speaking to each other, or arguing, and every point of view, as long as it wasn't modernist, essentially.
It's really interesting, isn't it? And to draw this first episode about the Prince to a close, it's also worth saying that conservation causes, as well as these urban conservation causes, that Dumfries House is another really important
Yes, that's true.
And that's almost a subject in its own right. But I think it is worth saying something about that.
I think that's very important. The plug was pulled on this architecture school really at the time of the Princess of Wales's tragic death, when I think people might look at things slightly differently now, but there was an enormous upswelling of public feeling which was expressed in the great bow wave of flowers that was left at the gates of Kensington Palace. And the Prince of Wales became very unpopular. His popularity rating absolutely plummeted. And the people who advised him were very anxious about the future of the monarchy, and they had a project which was to reinstate the prince in the good graces of the public and to get people to accept Camilla. Of course, both things have happened, and Camilla is now a queen. But at the time, it didn't look, and people were talking, I mean, it's crazy. It seemed to be crazy at the time, but people were saying, well, perhaps the prince is going to abdicate in favour of his eldest son. Well, that was never ever going to happen. But people were saying that sort of thing and saying it would be a good thing, which seems virtually unimaginable. But anyway, things had reached a very low ebb, and the advisors and the courtiers, the people who surrounded him, absolutely didn't want to have anything to do, didn't want the prince to make any comment which was
controversial,
and was going to be off message. And architecture was associated as being one of the things that people thought was a bit potty, and also it's controversial because you could have a pop at his ideas, and that was just going to be a big, big distraction. So this whole great, wonderful, creative project of the architecture school was simply disbanded overnight. It was all very painful. And, well, bits continue, and there's Royal Drawing School, which teaches classical drawing, and it was called Vita, which was about Islamic architecture. That continued. Bits of it continued under the Prince's Foundation, now the King's Foundation. But very sadly, the architecture school, I mean, imagine if that had continued and a whole generation of architects could have been trained in these, not to say that they do just what the Prince told them, but because that wasn't the point. This was such a creative environment with all these different paths and opportunities. We might have...
The world would be different.
The world would be different. Counterfactual. But Dumfries House was something that he could do, because Dumfries House was an important early work by the Adam brothers
in Scotland.
In Scotland, in a very poor area of Scotland, which has to be emphasised, which is East Ayrshire, where there have been coalfields. And these coalfields had, the deep mines had closed in the 1980s. And by the I can't quite remember the exact year, it was around about 2000 anyway, there'd been a big history of unemployment and social deprivation, and the indices of social deprivation, like teenage pregnancy and illiteracy and drugs and everything, they're all off the scale. So it was just dreadful. And it had been owned by an aristocratic family, the Marquis of Bute, and the Marchioness of Bute, the Dowager Marchioness, had been living there. And there'd been no interaction with the local community at all, except that people used to break in and kind of kick the balustrade off the bridges and things. So the Marquis of Bute had decided to sell it, and it contained a very important collection of furniture. There was a move to raise the money to buy it instead, and to cut a long story short, the Prince of Wales succeeded in intervening. He did a very unusual thing. He persuaded the Treasury, which oversees the Duchy of Cornwall, to let him borrow a large sum of money, £20 million, and this was going to be paid off by building some things on the building terraces.
Yes, a little village, really.
A sort of mini, and the sale of those houses was going to pay off the bank loan that he'd taken out. Essentially, this worked. And the pantechnicons, which were taking the old furniture for sale in London, were already, I think, on the motorway driving down.
I think they turned around in Carlisle, so the whole house was going to be stripped out.
Yes, the contents had been taken out, and these moving lorries had to be turned around and sent back again. So it was fantastic, very dramatic, and great achievement. But the amazing thing about Dumfries House is it was restored beautifully as a house, and this important collection of Chippendale and also contemporary Scottish furniture is all still in the house. But that isn't really, I don't think, the most striking thing about it, because there are other Georgian houses and there are other collections of furniture. But the Prince used Dumfries House as a place to revitalise this very deprived community, because he opened a whole series of vocational schools about the crafts, about hospitality, about cooking, about engineering, more recently about agriculture, which could train local people. It was really remarkable. And when he went there, he didn't take his valet. He went there in preference to Holyrood in Edinburgh, Holyrood Palace, which is where, the Buckingham Palace of Scotland, so to speak. And he spent his weeks in every year when he went up to Scotland at Dumfries House, which meant that all the bigwigs of Scotland had to go and see him there, somewhere that they'd never ever think of going to. And he would not take his valet. He would have one of these local people from his school, looking after him. I mean, it was really remarkable. So, I mean, he's much loved up there, and it's just been the most extraordinary achievement, with a wonderful, wonderful garden and these craft enterprises which have built little structures in the grounds and things like that. So this ancient building, which is beautiful in itself and interesting, but it's been made an engine for reviving the community. I don't think that story's really been very well told at all, because the media has always been interested in other things to do with the Princess of Wales. And
it's also relatively remote. I mean, obviously if you live in Ayrshire, it's not remote at all, but it's slightly off the beaten track.
It is off the beaten track, but you would have thought it would have got more attention because who was behind this project. But the media's always been, there've been political agendas to do with the Prince of Wales, which, and this hasn't played into the story that the media has wanted to tell.
It is peculiar, isn't it? It strikes me as very different from, we're familiar with the idea of, the National Trust gang together to save a house that's going to be sold and keeping its contents and everything. And what they tend to do with these places is try and restore them in some historical sense. I think it's what's so remarkable about Dumfries House when you go there is that you really do feel it's been restored as somebody's country house. I mean, the colour schemes are not attempting to be historicist. Yeah. The gardens are not attempting to recreate things. I mean, indeed, the gardens slightly, in my view, possibly overfilled with different structures, which have been presented to the Prince of Wales, now the King, by different people. It's a sort of typical story, but it's been realised in a very atypical way. And the walled garden and things are really extraordinary creations. And I agree, I think, if listeners have not been there, if I had a car, you could borrow mine to go there. It would be a wonderful place to see.
I mean, it is an extraordinary achievement, I think, and it's very personal. And of course, the King is in a position where he can do these things because people are happy to support him and to sponsor the projects that he's very interested in. But nevertheless, it's an amazing example of what can be done, which I can't really think of an equivalent.
No. Well, on that happy note, we should draw this podcast to a close, and we'll be revisiting some of the themes that we've talked about in our subsequent series on the King and his interest in architecture. Clive, thank you very much indeed.
Well, John, thank you. If you would like to find out more about this subject, read my book, King Charles III, 40 Years of Architecture, published by Triglyph Books, available in all the usual places, and www.triglyphbooks.com. Our next podcast will be about one of the greatest of all medieval buildings in use today. It's been with us for 900 years, Westminster Hall.